I am the Archsage Charlotte Eleanor. I once saved the world from cataclysm. At my master's behest, I was told to train 5 disciples and fall in love. I left behind 5 disciples, but didn't find love. Oh well, can't have it all, I guess. I think it's time to die. That's how it should have been. Instead, I woke up as a much younger version of myself. It's a sign. I'm going to live again and find love this time around. I'm supposedly 16 in my new life, but I just can't bring myself to date these babies. Finding love is really hard. Is that Dan? Why are you kidnapping people? Are you putting my eye patch on these people? Carthillion, I don't recall ever teaching you to just casually start wars on a whim. Urian, I was never a man. Why are you following this scumbag? Evan, I saved the world from these dark powers. I didn't ask you to become the new cataclysm. Why am I a cat? Jeffrey, why would you indenture yourself to me with forbidden magic? Are you insane? Somehow my new life is starting to look a lot like the old one.
I have mixed feelings on the webtoon Charlotte and her 5 disciples. There are so many negative aspects to this story. The plot should be simple, yet it somehow manages to constantly derail and undermine itself at every opportunity. Nearly every character except Charlotte herself is either horribly written or irrelevant. Even Charlotte herself is kinda static, but I suppose that's what you get when she's supposed to be a nearly complete character by design. To summarize, this webtoon is about a relatively static protagonist in a weak narrative surrounded by a large cast of feeble, underdeveloped characters who constantly derail the original plot's objective. By that scathing remark, this webtoon should suck. The art leads you to believe that this should be a dramatic journey, but if you look for any meaningful messages, then you're looking at this the wrong way. Rather, this webtoon should be viewed as a slapstick comedy. As a comedy, I'd say this webtoon does a pretty good job at keeping the readers amused, but most of the enjoyment you'll get from this story is from our protagonist, Charlotte Eleanor. I'm pretty confident when I say that Charlotte is the only thing keeping this train wreck together, because after 90 chapters, I honestly can't bring myself to care about either the story or the supporting cast. Relax, fans, I'm not all about the haterade. I will explain everything I just said, and it should be noted that I do think this webtoon merits a read-through. It is a fairly unique piece of work and definitely deserves some attention. Charlotte Eleanor is an Archsage, probably the best, like no one ever was. Her life's greatest achievement was putting an end to some demon king named Cataclysm, and lost an eye in the process. She's told by her master to leave behind a tangible legacy by creating disciples and finding love.
75 years later.
She's trained up 5 dysfunctional disciples and is now dying from some curse. After having lived over 100 years and picking up 5 sociopathic needy brats, she's understandably tired of living and decides to go die. While preparing a final spell to recycle her soul, she laments her only regret about not finding love. As if on cue, she wakes up to find that her body has reverted to a much younger version of herself and interprets this to mean that she's supposed to find love this time around. While wandering around town in her childlike state, she runs into her old acquaintance and longtime friend, Grand Duke Geoffrey den Lewister, who immediately recognizes Charlotte. The man has absolutely no doubt or hesitations about accepting that this young girl is actually Charlotte. That really does say a lot about his character. Probably the only well-defined aspect of it, to be honest. They discuss Charlotte's current state and her future plans, and we get a scene that really does a good job showing us how comfortable both Charlotte and Geoffrey are in each other's presence. I imagine it's kind of an awkward thing to explain how your rejuvenation stems from your regret of not finding love in your original life. To that end, Geoffrey sets up a new identity with new siblings for Charlotte and makes it clear to the readers that he's hoping to fill that love gap in her life, which obviously goes right over her head. Geoffrey's entire existence in this narrative is to enable Charlotte's new life and to provide her with some meaningful interaction with someone who isn't one of her dysfunctional disciples. And speaking of her disciples, after hearing the news of her death, with Charlotte herself opting not to let them know of her new life, they immediately barge into Geoffrey's home, threaten him, and proceed to become an international menace. Geoffrey, being the possessive person that he is, ignores the obvious flaws of leaving these disciples to their own destructive devices and decides to keep Charlotte's new existence to himself for the next 8 years.
Eventually.
And what do you know? 8 years later, and a 16-year-old Aria Lyson, Charlotte's new identity, still has difficulty finding love. Not for a lack of suitors or anything, but rather because she can't bring herself to date babies. She's chronologically 129 years old at this point, and understandably can't bring herself to take teenagers seriously. That kinda limits her options, because the only one the readers can reasonably expect to meet Charlotte's criteria is Jeffrey. It also helps drive home the point when he immediately shows up with flowers and practically admits he's aiming for her. Obviously, Charlotte can't just finish the series by noticing this, and instead asks if Jeffrey can possibly introduce her to someone over 90. Come on, Lottie, what does he have to do in order for you to notice him? It's very clear Jeffrey's been keeping her existence a secret and waiting for her to grow up so that he can pursue his affections. Now that I say it out loud, I feel kind of grossed out. Thankfully, I don't need to dwell on that thought for very long because Charlotte runs into her third disciple, Dan Monte. And this is where the series begins to live up to its title. The romance subplot takes a backseat as we go through an episodic journey with Charlotte to discipline her wayward disciples. Each one comes with their own personal issues and presents their own narrative problems. Dan Monte, Charlotte's third disciple, is criminally insane. He orders his lackeys to kidnap anyone who remotely has any characteristic feature of his late master. We're talking about the most superficial features here, like hair or eye color. There's absolutely no consideration for age, sex, or feature congruency here. He just lines up these people and puts an eye patch on them, hoping to find a match. I truly have no words for how terrible this whole operation is. Dan Monte is a social menace, and it's up to Charlotte to kick his ass into shape. Carthilian Trez Mabel, Charlotte's first disciple, is the king of the neighboring kingdom of Mabel. This man basically instigates a war to draw her out of hiding. It's truly baffling how the story even has the gall to suggest that he's a good king. He likes to shift between his older and younger form, and he's probably the most stable of the 5 disciples. However, that's an extremely low standard, and somehow his actions make no sense to me whatsoever. The only scene I remotely tolerated his presence is when Charlotte kicks his stupid ass over the cliff for being an idiot to incite an international incident. Urian Olivia, Charlotte's second disciple, is an elf completely devoid of any meaningful personality traits. She's suffering from plot-contrived amnesia and going around with an imposter of her master while supporting his acts of local terrorism. This Diet Charlotte imposter is male, a detail that this brainless elf somehow overlooks. So far, Charlotte has raised 2 felons and a war criminal. I'm starting to think she wasn't a very good mentor. Admittedly, Urian's backstory is okay, but her lack of personality beyond being a possessive guard dog only undermines her relevance. Her whole arc is about realizing that her current master is a no-good scumbag and for her to remember who her real master is. Eldo Cindy is Charlotte's 4th disciple and a fairy. She gets the most extensive backstory out of all the disciples and receives the only arc that remains tonally consistent. Up until her arc, every serious moment without fail is constantly being spoiled by poorly timed moments of levity. I think the author realized that creating constant tonal whiplashes between serious and joke moments really undermined the paper-thin narrative, so this was actually one of the better developments in the webtoon. Her most notable features are being an insufferable fairy supremacist and possessing a massive hate boner for Jeffrey. Eldo Cindy also had this thing about eradicating humanity in the past, but we already know that she currently doesn't feel that way, so this arc kinda had a weak premise to it. Most of her arc is actually in her past backstory, so she's the least troublesome of the disciples as she only opts to possess Charlotte's plot-irrelevant adoptive sibling and hold Charlotte herself captive until the mess with Evan gets sorted out. And speaking of which, Evan Serville is Charlotte's 5th and worst disciple. He's been showing up constantly throughout all the arcs like a zit and is just an all-around general nuisance. However, it's revealed that he's likely the cause of Charlotte's curse and shaping up to be the new Cataclysm. Let's tally this up now. Charlotte's disciples consist of 2 felons, 1 war criminal, and a recluse. Evan just tops all of that by being a potential apocalyptic global disaster. The irony here is that he's doing all of this for Charlotte, but seemingly gives no thought to any of the dire consequences his actions might cause. It's up to Charlotte to once again save the world from the problems caused by her brainless disciples. Charlotte Eleanor is truly the star of this webtoon, and it shows. The illustrator spends an absurd number of panels on picturesque close-ups of just her. She's probably the only character in this webtoon who actually makes any kind of sense. I'm being dead serious when I say that Charlotte is perhaps the only good thing about this story. This webtoon takes the bold approach of casting a mentor figure as the protagonist. This isn't really something you see that often because a mentor exists to develop another character. Apart from wanting to find love, Charlotte comes across as a fairly well-rounded and complete character. Sure, she's oblivious to Jeffrey's catcalling, but other than that, she's powerful, stable, composed, and always in control. The only thing that ever changes are the wacky scenarios where she frequently finds herself in. The Charlotte I see in the first couple of chapters is virtually identical to the Charlotte I see 90 chapters later. There's surprisingly little character growth, but it's still a blast to follow her and see how she handles everything that's thrown at her. It's a fascinating premise where I can see a story play out from the perspective of the mentor. Unfortunately, the story is a bit of a mess. Charlotte wanting to find love but having to deal with 5 disciples is simple enough to understand and really fun to explore. However, there seems to be a serious overarching plot involving Evan and Cataclysm. To put it bluntly, I don't think it works very well. The webtoon sort of jeopardized itself by trying very hard to be funny in the earlier arcs. The first 30 to 40 chapters are littered with constant moments of silliness at every opportunity. We the readers quickly learn that this is a story that doesn't want to take itself seriously. Dan Monty's entire arc is one giant joke, but I'm perfectly okay with that. However, Evan's overarching story arc is trying to set up something serious, but after going through the slapstick stupidity of Dan, Carthillion, and Urian, it's already too late because I'm already checked out where the story's concerned. Eldo Cindy's arc tries to rectify the tonal disparity by offering something a bit more serious, but I think changing the narrative tone so abruptly didn't do the webtoon any favors. I really enjoyed the lighthearted tone of the webtoon in the beginning because it has that SpongeBob quality of being stupid and fun. However, the tone begins to shift as the plot attempts to direct itself to the Cataclysm buildup. Honestly, I was just scrolling through Eldo Cindy's entire arc because of how little I actually cared about anyone that wasn't Charlotte or Jeffrey. I'll admit that I think Eldo's not a bad character, but she comes late into the story when I've already come to expect nothing from the 5 disciples. On that note, I genuinely have a hard time understanding or empathizing with any of Charlotte's disciples. Everything they do is nonsensical and falls apart under any kind of scrutiny. And because of that, I have an extremely hard time remotely caring about any of them. They're all terribly written, but I will say that most of them actually bounce off Charlotte's character fairly well. Sadly, as individuals, they have nothing going for them. Their backstories are completely undermined by their lack of development. Just think about it. We are seeing these disciples as they are after their traumatic past backstories. In other words, they're pretty much at the end of their narrative development arcs. Dan and Urian are just bland personality-devoid guard dogs. Carthillion is a whimsical ruler who doesn't seem to actually consider the political ramifications of his actions despite suffering from the political drama of succession in his youth. Eldo's entire arc had to be a giant flashback because her current self isn't plot relevant. And finally, Evan is quite possibly the worst character in the entire webtoon for how baffling his entire existence even is. It's somewhat asinine how Charlotte's new life is spent solving the world's problems again. The problems that are directly caused by these disciples. And what makes this even worse is that the disciples have zero chemistry with each other. It's so bad that the author had to make every disciple dislike each other by default. The world building is barely serviceable as we only ever see the 2 nations of Klaus and Mabel, but know very little about their political structures. This is kind of weird to me because the whole Cataclysm plot device is there to create a global threat, but is kind of undermined by how little I care about the world in which Charlotte lives in. The only one who's effectively aiding her in this endeavor is Jeffrey, but this man has his own brand of whack. After confronting Jeffrey about her disciples' lack of healthy coping mechanisms, Charlotte is made aware that they've been creating literal mountains of incidents reports over the last 8 years after her rebirth. Just stop and think about that for a moment. Jeffrey has been keeping secret tabs on every incident as Charlotte's disciples wreak havoc on the world. All 5 disciples are such a menace that Jeffrey legitimately believes Charlotte wanted to die just to escape them. This is some AAA comedy right here. It's almost hilarious how Jeffrey's entire existence is justified by his ability to enable Charlotte in her new life. At his core, he's essentially a hardcore who lives, breathes, and dreams of Charlotte. He practically gives her a wedding ring and indentured himself to her using a forbidden covenant circle. His delusion during Eldo's arc was of his married life with Charlotte, so I'm fairly certain what ship is being sailed here. And for what it's worth, I do think Jeffrey does have the healthiest dynamic with her. There's a natural chemistry between them, and Charlotte's best serious moments do occur with Jeffrey. It's also telling how he's the only one she trusted with her new life's purpose, and he in turn is the only one who truly understands her. Unlike many male love interests, Jeffrey stays in character throughout the entire series so far. He's still a wacky one-dimensional character, to be sure, but at least he's not undergoing a jarring transformation to meet the romantic subplot's needs. All in all, Charlotte and her 5 disciples starts off as a light-hearted and enjoyable read that's heavily carried by its protagonist. However, I do think only true fans will stick with it as the overarching plot with Cataclysm continues to develop. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is probably one of my more negative reviews, but I really do think that this webtoon is a pioneer for its medium. A story wholly carried by its protagonist is something truly amazing, and I would probably recommend it for that one aspect alone. Unless a major development occurs for the series, I don't think another video is necessary, so I'll finish up my review here. Anyway, if you enjoyed the content, then please consider liking and or subscribing to the channel as it helps me get a little bit more traffic. Please also feel free to leave any kind of feedback in the comments below, as I actually do read through them. I may not reply to all of them, but just know that I appreciate receiving them regardless of content or tone. That's all for now, Weebtooner signing off.